You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. ICE enforcement raids led to violent clashes between protesters and law enforcement in Los Angeles this weekend. President Trump mobilized the National Guard against the wishes of the state's governor, Gavin Newsom. It's the first time a president has done so since the 1960s. Both Newsom and L.A. Mayor Karen Bass have vocally criticized the move, with Newsom calling it a, quote, unmistakable step towards authoritarianism. Coming up in just a few minutes, we're going to talk to Washington Attorney General Nick Brown about his take on what's been going on in California and how it could affect Washington state. But first, over 50 people were arrested in L.A. this weekend. More protests are planned today. And this is something we are watching closely here in Seattle as a Democrat-led city in a heavily blue state with a history of its own showdowns with the Trump administration. Nigel Duara is an L.A.-based reporter for CalMatters, and he's been reporting on what's going on in L.A. and the ways the political showdown between California and the Trump administration has led up to this. Nigel, welcome to the show. Thanks for speaking with me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So it seems like a bit of a day of calm Monday after some clashes between protesters and police, especially in downtown L.A. yesterday. There was some Waymos set on fire. Nigel, what is the feeling in the city right now? Just a mood check on L.A.
Sure. There are kind of two things happening, right? We observed it yesterday at a protest. On the one hand, brunch is continuing apace at the cafes. On the other hand, there are giant protests, sometimes right across the street. You wouldn't necessarily know that there's something happening, except for bus lines are getting delayed. There's a smell wafting down from downtown, which is a mix of tear gas and those burning Waymos you were talking about. People I wouldn't describe as scared, but there's certainly a population within the LA population that is extremely, extremely scared right now.
Yeah, and I would imagine you're talking about the immigrant community, especially people without documentation. Can you remind us, Nigel, how did events unfold in LA starting late last week? What led up to these protests and then the president's decision to mobilize the Guard?
Sure. So starting back in January, President Trump pretty clearly put a target on California and said that, things were going to change in the state, essentially. And we saw enforcement actions in the Central Valley leading up to this. We saw enforcement actions in San Diego. And then they did something which really hasn't been done in a while, which is a worksite raid. They did a worksite raid at a garment factory in downtown in the Fashion District. That was the start of it. Then on Saturday, there were more enforcement actions. And then on Sunday, there were more enforcement actions. And so a lot of what you're seeing on television are the protests against this. A lot of what we haven't seen so much is the people actually being detained.
Yeah. And the protests on Saturday, there was some activity downtown, but a lot of it happened in Paramount, which is technically outside of the city of L.A., to the south, and in Compton. Of course, on Sunday, when the National Guard arrived, you saw some of those images of, the confrontation between protesters and law enforcement. Now, Nigel, you mentioned that it's L.A. This is a place that's huge. It's diverse. You can have people having brunch across the street from a big protest going on. I understand you were in Pasadena, just east of Los Angeles, yesterday, where the protests took on a very different tenor. Can you briefly describe what was going on there?
Sure. In Pasadena, the word got out, and we haven't confirmed this yet, but the word got out that there were ICE agents, immigration enforcement agents, staying at that hotel. And people also said that they were asking individual staff members about their immigration status, and that they also identified some vehicles parked in the garage next door. So a big protest, 350, 400 people in Pasadena,
This is just to tell people, it's a suburb. It's not known for being like a hotbed of activism. Yeah.
Yeah, it's about the opposite. But they were out there yesterday. Pasadena residents were out there yesterday. And their goal was basically to get this hotel and a couple other hotels to remove the ICE agents, to say that you cannot stay here. They want to make immigration enforcement agents as uncomfortable as possible, as quickly as possible.
And how did that resolve?
We are reporting that right now. From what we understand, there may have been some decision from the hotel management in terms of what they're going to do next, but we're still reporting that out.
Just back to the issue of mobilizing the Guard, Nigel, this is a significant ramping up on the part of the Trump administration in its series of ways that it has gone up against California, policy-wise, when it comes to regulation, when it comes to social issues. In your reporting, you place it in the context with these showdowns. Can you kind of give us that bigger picture of, how President Trump and in some ways Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, have used their differences to lob these big political shots over the years?
Sure. Political shots and lawsuits, right? I think we're up to 4 or 5 that begin state of California versus Trump, and then another dozen or more that the state has joined. But yeah, the ethos of California, at least in the imagination, right, of the rest of the country, is kind of an affront to what the Trump administration wants, right, in terms of environmental policy, in terms of gay rights, in terms of its crime policy, refusal to use the death penalty. So you can see how coming for California is not just the actual rounding up of people, but actually is a big signal, right, politically, to say this, look, we're doing it, right? If you guys want to see the images, we are here, and we are trying to change this place and make California more like the rest of the country. So I can understand that. Of course, as you mentioned, for Newsom, yeah, this has pretty much been most of his term, with the 4 years of Biden accepted, where he's been facing off with Trump and making hay over that. Our previous Attorney General, Xavier Becerra, same deal, challenging Trump. So yes, these are actions that are going to resonate with their respective bases.
I think that's why we find it so interesting here in Seattle, because this is a state where Governor Inslee before him and now Governor Ferguson has really kind of put the flagpole down and said, we are going to fight the Trump administration. As Attorney General, our current governor sued the Trump administration something like 100 times. Current Attorney General Nick Brown, who I'm going to talk to in just a couple minutes here, has also sued the Trump administration a number of times. And yeah, we have a history of very high-profile protests in the city of Seattle. So this is something that I think a lot of, especially West Coast blue cities, are going to look at L.A. and say, hey, are we potentially next? I mean, just in the terms of the narrative of what's going on here, President Trump is known to be really good at also controlling the media cycle. Is there a sense, Nigel, and I don't want you to get out too far, I don't want to put you in a bad position in terms of editorializing here, but is there a sense that this is a golden opportunity for President Trump to control the narrative after a very high-profile meltdown with one of his closest advisors last week?
So I certainly can't speak to the turmoil in D.C., but what I would suggest to folks in Washington State and Oregon is that when it comes to the federal government, right, state borders are just a line. They don't really matter. So what's happening to California right now, as you mentioned, could absolutely be something that Seattle could look at. Stephen Miller's wife was asking why there's a little Havana in Miami, right? So you hear these noises and you hear these sort of suggestions and oblique things, and then all of a sudden you actually do see rage. We saw that in California. Trump was sort of making a lot of noise about it. And then next thing you know, there are certainly HSI agents and ICE agents enforcing immigration laws and grabbing people and doing these raids. We're certainly not in a position to know whether President Trump is doing this essentially for the dog and pony show or because of a genuine desire to remove people in the country illegally. But certainly, as we said, it is playing with a certain base, and you can see that. California has the third most Trump voters in the country, right? One of the only 3 states with more than 6 million people voting for Trump. So while sure it plays the rest of the country, there's certainly a lot of people within California that this is working for too.
Before we go, Nigel, these protests, they've gained a lot of support. There's a lot of allyship in Los Angeles for the immigrant community, but undocumented folks are still dealing with these ramped up and more aggressive ICE raids and immigration enforcement, even when they, may be going to scheduled appointments to check in about their immigration status. People have been arrested or detained. That sense of fear, how has it manifested in neighborhoods in Los Angeles? I mean, are you seeing, for example, people hesitating to go to work in response to these ramped up sweeps?
Sure, and we're still reporting out the effects, the impacts here, neighborhood to neighborhood in Los Angeles. But what I can tell you is that absolutely when these raids started this year, take the Central Valley, for instance, which is what we call the sort of the main farming area in the middle of California, there were measurable impacts on fear. People were not coming to pick oranges, so picking day had to be pushed back. Churches were seeing drops of 30, 40, 50% or more. Just talking to folks up there and in places even closer to Los Angeles, absolutely there's a culture of fear. People are watching out for these white trucks. That's always what immigration enforcement comes in. It's some brand of an American-made white truck. And that becomes this obsession. Folks are going to the grocery store, they're looking for white trucks. They're driving down the street, they're looking for white trucks. And so you can imagine that kind of sentiment taking over with specifically the undocumented population, right? Walking down the street, you may not know who's undocumented and who's not. But there are people that won't know are in a real state of fear right now.
Nigel Duara is an LA-based reporter for CalMatters, reporting on the protests there, the National Guard getting mobilized by the Trump administration, and the fallout. Nigel, really appreciate your reporting today. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And by the way, if you have any reaction to what's been going on in California, its implications for Washington State and Seattle, or questions about what's going on, you can always leave us a voicemail at 206-221-3213. That's 206-221-3213. Or email us those comments or questions at soundside@kuow.org. Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at kuow.org.